Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The perplexing crime. It was on a damp and mist-laden morning in late October that I found myself once again in the familiar quarters of 220 Baker Street. The air carried the distinct scent of damp tobacco and old books, mingling with the faint traces of the previous night's experiments. Holmes had no doubt been engaged in one of his peculiar chemical analyses. My friend sat in his accustomed chair, fingers steepled before his sharp, angular face, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling in quiet contemplation. His mood, I had learned, was often as mercurial as the London fog, and today he exhibited that curious stillness which signified the workings of his remarkable intellect. "Ah, Watson," he murmured without shifting his gaze, "you have been at the surgery this morning, I take it? And your last patient was a man of nervous disposition, perhaps suffering from a complaint of the stomach?" I started, though by now I should have been accustomed to his deductions. "Indeed, Holmes, but how?" He waved a hand dismissively. "A small ink blot on your cuff, the precise shade of which suggests medical prescriptions. The faint scent of peppermint upon your coat, commonly used for digestive ailments, and your right sleeve slightly more wrinkled than the left, evidence of a patient who gripped your arm in distress." I could only shake my head in admiration. Your methods never fail to astonish me. Before Holmes could deliver one of his usual quips about the simplicity of his reasoning, there was a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson, ever efficient, entered with the announcement, "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He appears quite beside himself with worry." Holmes sat forward at once, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Show him in." A moment later, a tall, gaunt man in his 50s entered, his face pale beneath his well-groomed moustache. He was impeccably dressed in a dark morning suit, though his gloved hands trembled as he removed his hat. "You must help me, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "It is a most dreadful affair. My daughter has vanished without a trace on the very eve of her wedding." Holmes gestured to a chair. "Compose yourself, sir. Begin at the beginning." The man took a deep breath. "My name is Colonel Archibald Harrington. My daughter, Miss Evelyn Harrington, was to be married yesterday at St. Bartholomew's Church. She left our home in Mayfair at precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, accompanied by her maid and a hired carriage. The ceremony was scheduled for noon, but she never arrived at the church." "Never arrived?" I repeated. "Not a trace of her," he said. "The carriage was found abandoned in an alleyway near Covent Garden. The driver is missing, and my daughter, she has vanished into thin air." Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes narrowing. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Watson, I believe we have a case worthy of our attention." The peculiarities of the case. Colonel Archibald Harrington sat stiffly in the chair opposite Holmes, his face a mask of controlled anguish. The firelight flickered across his weathered features, casting deep shadows beneath his eyes. Holmes, ever the master of silent observation, studied the man with a piercing gaze. Then, in his usual languid manner, he reached for his pipe and spoke. "Let us proceed with precision, Colonel. You say your daughter was last seen entering the hired carriage from your residence in Mayfair. Who was the driver?" "A man by the name of Samuel Kent," Harrington replied. "A reliable fellow. We have employed his services on numerous occasions. He was hired specifically for the occasion." "And the maid who accompanied your daughter?" "Miss Abigail Lawson. She has been in our household for years, deeply devoted to Evelyn. She too has disappeared." Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke, his expression unreadable. "Curious. And the intended groom, who is he?" The Colonel's lips tightened. "Mr. Albert Whittington, a young barrister of excellent repute. He and Evelyn have been engaged these past 6 months. He was waiting at St. Bartholomew's when the news reached him." Holmes glanced at me briefly before directing his next question. "What were the circumstances of the carriage's discovery?" Harrington hesitated, his fingers tightening over the brim of his hat. "A constable on patrol near Covent Garden found it abandoned in a side street, empty, save for a single item. And that item was—" "A wedding slipper," the Colonel said grimly. "Evelyn's. It lay upon the seat as though she had stepped out of it in great haste or been forcibly removed." Holmes's eyes gleamed with intrigue. "Indeed, and no witnesses, no one saw the carriage arrive?" The Colonel shook his head. "None have come forward." For a long moment Holmes sat motionless, his fingertips pressed together. Then, without warning, he sprang to his feet. "Come, Watson. This case calls for immediate action. We shall begin at the scene of the disappearance." But you have not yet agreed to take the case," the Colonel stammered. Holmes offered a slight smile. "My dear Colonel, I took the case the moment you uttered the words, 'vanished without a trace.' Undo." And with that, we set off into the fog-choked streets of London, drawn inexorably into a mystery unlike any other. The search for clues. The October mist clung to the streets of London like a ghostly shroud, as Holmes and I followed Colonel Harrington's carriage through the city. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones echoed in the damp air, and a steady drizzle began to fall, adding a further sense of gloom to our errand. Covent Garden was quieter than usual at this late morning hour, the market vendors only, just beginning their trade. The carriage pulled to a halt near the mouth of a narrow alleyway off Southampton Street, where a uniformed constable stood at attention. He straightened at our approach and tipped his helmet. "This is the spot, gentlemen," he announced. "Found the carriage just here last evening, abandoned." Holmes stepped forward, his keen eyes sweeping the scene before him. The carriage itself was an elegant black landau, its doors closed, its lanterns extinguished. Though the vehicle had already been examined by the authorities, Holmes wasted no time in conducting his own meticulous inspection. He first studied the ground, crouching low and tracing his long fingers across the damp cobblestones. Then he peered inside, his gaze flicking over every inch of the plush interior. With delicate precision, he reached in and retrieved a small satin slipper from the seat. "This is the item found within?" he inquired. "Yes, sir." The constable confirmed. "Miss Harrington's, according to her father." Holmes turned the slipper over in his hands, his expression unreadable. "Watson, what do you observe?" I leaned closer, scrutinizing the dainty object. "It is a fine piece of craftsmanship. White satin, undoubtedly made for the wedding. but beyond that I see little of significance." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Come now, Watson, consider the circumstances." I furrowed my brow. "It lies upon the seat, which suggests it was removed inside the carriage, not lost in a struggle outside." "Precisely," Holmes exclaimed. "Had our missing bride been forcibly taken, the slipper would likely be found upon the ground, or at the very least in some state of disorder. Yet it remains here, deliberately placed. Curious, is it not?" The Colonel, who had been listening intently, took a step forward. "But what does it mean, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the exterior of the carriage, running his fingers along the door handle before inspecting the edges of the windows. Then, without warning, he bent down and retrieved something from beneath the vehicle. A small, dark fragment. "Ah," he murmured, holding it up for examination. "Most intriguing." "What is it?" I asked. "A torn piece of cloth, Watson, and not from a wedding dress, I assure you." Holmes pocketed the fragment and straightened, his expression suddenly alight with fresh purpose. "We must next speak with the stablemaster who rented out this carriage. Come, gentlemen, the game is afoot." And with that, we stepped back into our own waiting cab, setting forth into the ever-deepening mystery. The stablemaster's account. The rain had settled into a fine mist by the time our carriage pulled up before a modest but well-kept livery stable off Charing Cross Road. The establishment belonged to a Mr. Benjamin Cobb, a wiry old man with a weathered face and a limp that suggested a life spent around horses. He eyed us warily as we approached, his hands buried in the pockets of his coarse woolen coat. "If you've come about that missing lady, I've already spoken to the constables," he grumbled. Holmes removed his gloves with measured patience. "And yet, Mr. Cobb, they lack the ability to observe what I shall observe. Now tell me, who hired out the landau in question?" Cobb sniffed and glanced toward the covered stalls, where a few tired-looking horses shifted in their pens. "A fellow by the name of Samuel Kent. Been hiring from me for months, he has. Steady work, good pay, nothing out of the ordinary." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And yet—" Cobb hesitated. "Well, if you must know, he was different this time. Twitchy. Kept looking over his shoulder like someone was watching him. Paid in advance, too, which he never does." Holmes exchanged a glance with me before continuing. "And tell me, Mr. Cobb, was the horse found with the carriage still one of yours?" "Aye, that's the strange thing. The carriage was mine, but not the horse. Can't say where he got that beast. Mean-looking thing. A real runner." Holmes nodded, his fingers drumming idly against his cane. "And what of Samuel Kent? Has he been seen since?" Cobb shook his head. "Not a sign of him. Gone like smoke, he has." At this the Colonel stiffened. "Then he must have been in on it. He was the last to see my daughter, and now he's vanished." Holmes raised a hand to quiet him. "Patience, Colonel. The obvious answer is often the most misleading." He turned back to Cobb. "Did he say where he was bound when he took the carriage? Just that he had a wedding job? Nothing else?" Holmes pondered this, then cast his eyes about the stable-yard. With precise steps, he moved to where the carriages were kept, crouching near the entrance to examine the muddy ground. After a moment, he retrieved something small and glinting. "A brass button," he murmured. "Watson, make note of this." I did so at once, though its significance escaped me. "From a coat, I presume?" "Undoubtedly." Holmes turned it over in his palm. "And yet, a curious thing, this button bears the crest of a rather particular club." The Colonel stepped forward. "Which club?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The Albion Gentlemen's Club. A most exclusive establishment, if I recall correctly." At this revelation, Colonel Harrington's face darkened. "Whittington is a member of the Albion Club." Holmes' expression did not change, but I sensed his interest deepen. "Indeed. Then it seems our next course of action is clear." He turned on his heel, his coat flaring as he strode toward the waiting carriage. "Come, Watson. The trail grows warmer." And with that, we set off toward the heart of London's elite, knowing full well that deception often wore the mask of respectability. A conversation at the Albion Club. Our carriage rolled through the misty streets toward Pawley Mall, where the grand facade of the Albion Gentlemen's Club loomed through the evening fog. Gas lamps flickered in their glass enclosures, illuminating the heavy oak doors that guarded the entrance to one of London's most exclusive establishments. Holmes stepped out first, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve before presenting his card to the doorman, who scrutinized it with a raised brow. Colonel Harrington, still visibly agitated, cleared his throat impatiently. "We wish to speak with Mr. Albert Whittington," Holmes said smoothly. "It is a matter of some urgency." The doorman hesitated, but, upon recognizing Colonel Harrington, inclined his head and gestured toward the lobby. "Mr. Whittington is in the reading room, sir. Shall I announce you?" "No need," Holmes replied. "We shall find our own way." Inside, the club exuded wealth and tradition. Mahogany panelling, Persian rugs, and the quiet murmur of conversation among well-dressed gentlemen. We found Whittington seated near the fireplace, an untouched brandy in his hand and a distant look in his eye. At the sight of us, he rose abruptly. "Colonel, any news of Evelyn?" Harrington regarded him with cold suspicion. "None. That is why we are here." Holmes studied Whittington with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Whittington, might I trouble you with a few questions?" "Of course, anything." Holmes eased into a chair opposite him, steepling his fingers. "Tell me, sir, did Miss Harrington seem troubled in the days leading up to the wedding?" Whittington hesitated, glancing between us. "No, at least I don't believe so. She was excited, of course, perhaps a little anxious, but that is natural, is it not?" Holmes did not respond to the question. Instead, he retrieved something from his pocket and placed it upon the table, a brass button. Whittington frowned. "What is this?" "A button, Mr. Whittington," Holmes said. "It was found near the carriage from which your fiancée disappeared. It bears the crest of this very club." Whittington paled. "That is hardly unusual. Many men own coats with such buttons." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "Yet it was torn from a coat in some haste. I wonder, do you recognize it?" The young barrister's hand twitched slightly as he took the button. He turned it over in his fingers before shaking his head. "No, I cannot say that I do." Holmes leaned forward. "And what of Samuel Kent? Do you know him?" Whittington stiffened. "Kent? The carriage driver?" "No, I've never met him." Holmes held his gaze for a moment, then abruptly stood. "Very well. I believe that is all for now." Whittington exhaled sharply, relief flickering across his features. "Then, if you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I must return home. I have hardly slept since Evelyn vanished." Colonel Harrington made a sound of disapproval, but said nothing. We watched, in silence as Whittington departed, his steps brisk, but his shoulders tense. As soon as he was out of earshot, I turned to Holmes. "You do not believe him?" A shadow of a smile played upon Holmes's lips. "My dear Watson, he is drowning in falsehoods, but it is not yet time to expose them. First, we must unravel what he is so desperate to hide." He retrieved his pocket watch, checking the time. "Come, we have one more visit to make this evening." "To where?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "To the one person who may know what truly happened inside that carriage, Miss Abigail Lawson, the missing maid." And with that, we stepped once more into the London night, the mystery deepening with every passing hour. The vanished maid, and a sinister warning. The evening had deepened into a chill, and the gas lamps flickered like pale sentinels as we made our way toward the modest lodgings of Miss Abigail Lawson. Holmes had obtained her address from Colonel Harrington, though the Colonel himself had little hope that we would find her. "She was devoted to my daughter," he had said gravely. "If she has vanished, it is not by her own will." The narrow streets of Southwark led us to a small boarding-house, tucked between a tobacconist's shop and a dimly lit public house. The landlady, a stout woman in a well-worn apron, regarded us suspiciously when we inquired about her tenant. "Abigail Lawson?" she repeated. "She ain't here." Holmes studied her intently. "When did you last see her?" The landlady sniffed. "2 nights past. Left in a hurry, she did. Looked pale as a ghost." "Did she say where she was going?" I asked. "No, sir. Just packed a bag and rushed out." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. But I did hear her muttering something. Sounded like she was frightened. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "What did she say?" The landlady frowned in concentration. "Something about not safe any more, and he knows." Holmes and I exchanged glances. "Did she receive any visitors before she disappeared?" Holmes asked. The woman nodded. "A man came by the night before. I didn't see him proper, but he left a note for her." Holmes extended a hand. "Would you happen to have it?" The landlady hesitated. "I shouldn't—" Holmes slipped a coin into her palm with practised ease. With a begrudging sigh, she shuffled to a side table and retrieved a folded slip of paper. "She threw it in the waste bin. Thought it might be important, so I kept it." Holmes unfolded the note and scanned its contents. His eyes gleamed with interest. "Abigail, you are in danger. Do not speak to anyone. Meet me at the old mill at midnight. Tell no one. S.K." "Samuel Kent," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "It would seem our missing driver is not quite as vanished as we thought." The landlady wrung her hands. "You don't think she's hurt, do you?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he turned to me. "Watson, I believe our next destination is clear." I swallowed. "The old mill?" "Precisely." Colonel Harrington, who had remained silent thus far, now stepped forward, his face etched with worry. "If Abigail went there, she may already be in grave danger." Holmes pocketed the note, his expression unreadable. Then we must not delay. And with that, we stepped once more into the fog-choked streets, drawn inexorably toward the heart of the mystery, and whatever grim truth awaited us at the old mill. Shadows at the old mill. The wind had picked up by the time we reached the old mill on the outskirts of London. The derelict structure loomed against the night sky, its once sturdy wooden beams weathered and warped with age. The great water wheel stood still, its rotting spokes casting twisted shadows beneath the pale glow of the moon. We had left our carriage some distance away, approaching on foot to avoid detection. Colonel Harrington, though still visibly anxious, followed our lead in silence. Holmes, moving with his usual calculated grace, paused at the entrance and gestured for us to stop. "Observe," he murmured. I peered past him and felt a shiver run through me. The mill's heavy door, though slightly ajar, bore fresh scuff marks along its edge. The dirt around the threshold was disturbed, and faint boot prints trailed inward. 2 sets, one significantly smaller than the other. "Someone has been here recently," I whispered. "Indeed," Holmes agreed, "and if I am not mistaken, they may still be inside." With that, he slipped through the opening, moving like a shadow. Colonel Harrington and I followed cautiously, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floorboards. The air inside was damp, filled with the scent of old timber and stagnant water. Holmes held up a hand, signalling us to stop. Somewhere in the darkness, the faintest of sounds reached our ears. A rustling movement, followed by a low murmur of voices. Holmes pressed himself against the wooden railing of the upper level and motioned for us to do the same. Below, in the dim light of a single flickering lantern, 2 figures stood near a stack of discarded sacks. One of them, a man with a hunched posture and a nervous energy about him, I recognized at once. "Samuel Kent," I whispered. The other figure, wrapped in a dark cloak, stood half in shadow. Their features were obscured, but there was no mistaking the small, trembling frame of a woman. "Miss Lawson," Holmes murmured. At that moment, Kent's voice carried through the hollow chamber. "You shouldn't have come here, Abby. It's not safe." "I didn't have a choice," the maid replied, her voice shaking. "You know what happened to her, don't you? Evelyn, where is she?" Kent shifted uneasily. I can't say, but I know she was afraid. Something was wrong. She told me." A sudden noise from outside, a sharp, splintering crack, sent both figures into a panic. Abigail gasped and clutched at Kent's arm. "They found me!" he hissed. I knew this was a mistake. Holmes did not hesitate. In an instant he was moving, descending the rickety staircase with practised agility. Colonel Harrington and I followed at once. Kent turned at the sound of our approach, his eyes wild with fear. "No, stay back!" Holmes raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Mr. Kent, you are not in danger from us. But if someone is pursuing you, we must act quickly." Before Kent could answer, another noise, this time closer, sent a jolt through all of us. Heavy footfalls pounded against the wooden floor outside, and then, with a force that rattled the very beams of the structure, the mill door burst open. A towering figure in a dark coat stood silhouetted against the moonlight, his breath heavy with exertion. Holmes exhaled softly. "Ah, right on time. I reached instinctively for the revolver at my side, but Holmes held up a hand to stay me. "Gentlemen," he said with a faint smile, "it appears our pursuer has arrived." The figure took a slow step forward, and for the first time, the lantern's glow illuminated his face. Colonel Harrington let out a sharp breath. "Whittington!" The young barrister's expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched at his sides. His gaze flicked toward Abigail, then to Kent. "No more running," he said quietly. "It's time to tell the truth." Holmes inclined his head. "Yes, Mr. Whittington, I quite agree." And with that, the night's intrigue reached its boiling point. Whittington's confession. The silence that followed Whittington's entrance was thick with tension. The young barrister stood in the doorway, his breath heavy from exertion, eyes darting between us. Samuel Kent and Abigail Lawson had retreated a step, pressing themselves against the old sacks as if bracing for a blow. Colonel Harrington, his fists clenched, took a step forward, but Holmes raised a hand, halting any outburst. "Mr. Whittington," Holmes said calmly, "you seem rather eager to join our little gathering." Whittington swallowed hard, his composure cracking. "I had no choice," he said hoarsely. "I overheard Kent arranging this meeting. I knew he would tell you everything." His gaze flicked to Kent. "And I cannot allow that." Kent flinched. I didn't mean—" "No harm, sir, but this has gone too far. Miss Evelyn—" "Is alive," Holmes interjected, his voice ringing through the mill. A collective gasp filled the air. Colonel Harrington staggered slightly, and even I found myself staring at Holmes in disbelief. Whittington's face drained of colour, his expression caught between relief and terror. Holmes took a slow step forward, his piercing gaze locking onto the barrister. "You knew, didn't you?" he said softly. "You have known all along that Evelyn did not vanish into thin air. The real question is, why did you not say anything?" Whittington's jaw clenched. "You don't understand. Enlighten us," Holmes said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that brooked no refusal. For a moment, it seemed Whittington would deny everything, but then, with a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagged. "Because she ran away." Colonel Harrington let out a strangled noise. "Ran away? Impossible!" Whittington met his gaze with desperate honesty. "She did not wish to marry me, Colonel. I thought she did, but in the days leading up to the wedding, she grew restless. She confided in me that she felt trapped, that she was making a mistake." A terrible silence followed. The Colonel, visibly shaken, opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Whittington turned to Kent. "She asked me for help. I refused. I thought she would change her mind, but she must have reached out to Kent instead." Kent nodded quickly. "That's right, sir. She told me she wanted out, that she needed to leave before the wedding. I couldn't say no. I drove her away that night." Holmes tilted his head. "And where is she now?" Whittington exhaled slowly. "I don't know." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "You are lying, Mr. Whittington." The young barrister flinched. Holmes stepped closer, his voice sharpening. "You had every opportunity to tell the truth, yet you remained silent. You allowed Scotland Yard to bungle their investigation, allowed Miss Lawson to be driven into hiding. Why? because you know where she is and you are protecting her." Chester Whittington clenched his fists. "You don't understand," he repeated, his voice cracking. "If I tell you where she is, she will never forgive me." Colonel Harrington, who had remained motionless throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Albert, I swear to you, if my daughter is safe, if she is well, I do not care about anything else. But I must know the truth." Whittington turned to him, his face contorted in agony. "She is safe," he whispered. "I swear it." Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed his suspicions. "Then it is time to stop this game of half-truths, Mr. Whittington. Take us to her." For a moment, Whittington seemed ready to refuse. Then, with a shuddering breath, he lowered his gaze. "Very well," he said quietly. "I will take you to Evelyn." Holmes smiled faintly. A wise decision. And with that, the mystery, at last, began to unravel. The hidden sanctuary. The journey was a tense one. Whittington, his face pale and drawn, led us through the darkened streets of London in silence. Holmes and I walked on either side of him, while Colonel Harrington and Samuel Kent followed closely behind. Abigail Lawson, still shaken, had been sent home under strict orders from Holmes to remain indoors until further notice. Our path took us away from the main thoroughfares and into the quieter, more secluded parts of the city. Whittington hesitated, more than once, as if debating whether to continue. But each time, a single sharp glance from Holmes propelled him forward. Finally, we arrived at a modest townhouse, nestled between two larger buildings, on a street so unremarkable that it seemed the perfect place to disappear. A single gas lamp flickered at the far end of the road, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Holmes regarded the house with interest. "An excellent hiding place," he murmured. Whittington hesitated at the doorstep, his hand hovering over the brass knocker. Then, taking a deep breath, he rapped 3 times. A long pause followed. Then, at last, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the dimly lit entryway, her face partially obscured by the flickering glow of a single candle. She was dressed in a plain gown, her dark hair pulled back into a simple plait. But even in the subdued light, there was no mistaking her. Colonel Harrington let out a strangled gasp. "Evelyn!" The young woman's eyes widened in shock. Her father? Before she could retreat, the colonel stepped forward, his voice trembling. "My God, child, you are alive!" Evelyn swallowed hard, her grip tightening around the candle. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, "but I couldn't go through with it. I had to leave." Holmes stepped into the doorway, his gaze keen. "And yet you could not have vanished so completely on your own." Evelyn hesitated, then turned her eyes to Whittington. "Albert helped me." Colonel Harrington's expression darkened, but Evelyn quickly continued. "Not at first, he refused, but when he realized how desperate I was, he gave me money and arranged for me to stay here, under the care of an old family acquaintance." Holmes glanced at Whittington. "And yet, rather than confess this when she disappeared, you allowed yourself to become the prime suspect in a case of foul play." Whittington looked away. "She begged me not to tell. I thought I could protect her." Evelyn took a shaky breath. I knew my disappearance would cause a scandal, but I couldn't marry Albert. I respect him, but I do not love him." Her father's expression softened. "Then why not tell me?" Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. "Because you wouldn't have listened." A terrible silence followed. The Colonel, his face etched with pain, looked as though he wanted to protest, but then his shoulders slumped, and he sighed heavily. "Perhaps you are right," he admitted. Holmes, who had remained quiet through the exchange, suddenly spoke. "There is one final question that troubles me." His sharp gaze locked onto Evelyn. "Why did you confide in Samuel Kent?" Evelyn blinked. "I never did." A startled silence followed. Kent's face turned ashen. "Miss Evelyn, I only wanted to help." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, Mr. Kent, I do believe you have a confession of your own to make." Evelyn frowned. "I don't understand." Holmes took a slow step forward, his voice smooth as silk. "Miss Lawson received a note warning her of danger, signed with Samuel Kent's initials. And yet you claim you never spoke to him, which means—" He turned to Kent. "The warning came not from Evelyn, but from you." Kent trembled. I don't." Holmes cut him off with a single raised finger. "You knew something you were too afraid to say outright, and so you tried to warn Abigail instead." Evelyn's breath hitched. "What are you saying?" Holmes's voice was cool and measured. "I am saying, Miss Harrington, that while you chose to disappear, someone else had plans for you that were far more sinister." A chill ran through me as Holmes turned his gaze back to Kent. "Tell us, Mr. Kent, what is it that you truly fear?" Kent swallowed hard, his hands trembling, and then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "They were going to kill her." A stunned silence followed. Then Evelyn whispered, "Who?" Kent lifted his eyes, haunted and afraid. I don't know, but I heard them talking. The night before the wedding, I was in the stables tending the horses. 2 men were speaking outside. One of them mentioned Miss Evelyn by name, said she wouldn't make it to the altar." A slow dread settled over the room. Holmes inhaled deeply. "So it was never about a runaway bride," he murmured. "It was about a murder that never happened." Evelyn's face went pale. "But who would want me dead?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "That, Miss Harrington, is the final mystery we must solve." The web tightens. A heavy silence filled the small townhouse as Samuel Kent's trembling words hung in the air. The implications were chilling. Evelyn Harrington had not merely fled from an unwanted marriage. She had unknowingly escaped an attempt on her life. Colonel Harrington, who had remained remarkably composed thus far, suddenly surged forward, his voice thunderous. Who would dare plot against my daughter?" Holmes raised a hand, silencing him with an almost imperceptible motion. Boom! Keen eyes flickered with thought, as if assembling the final pieces of an intricate puzzle. "Patience, Colonel. The answer is within our grasp." He turned his attention back to Kent. "Tell me exactly what you overheard that night in the stables. Spare no detail." Kent swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. It was dark. I couldn't see their faces. But the voices. One was deep and rough, the other softer, more refined. The first man said something about Miss Evelyn not making it to the altar. The other replied, "It must be done before morning." Evelyn's breath hitched, and she clutched the back of a nearby chair for support. "They were planning to kill me before the wedding." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And yet you vanished before they could act. Quite the stroke of fortune." His gaze sharpened. "But fortune alone does not explain everything. Who, Miss Harrington, would stand to gain the most from your demise?" Evelyn hesitated. I don't know. My father is my only living family, and my inheritance is secure." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "And Mr. Whittington?" The young barrister stiffened. "What are you suggesting?" Holmes ignored the protest. "You were to marry Evelyn, and upon doing so, you would have gained access to a significant portion of her fortune. But if Evelyn were to die before the wedding, her wealth would pass elsewhere. The question is, where?" A shadow crossed Whittington's face. "To her father, of course." A sharp breath escaped Evelyn's lips, and all eyes turned to Colonel Harrington. His face was a mixture of shock and fury. "You dare accuse me?" Holmes's voice was as calm as ever. "No, Colonel. If you were involved, you would not have spent the past weeks desperately searching for your daughter, which means someone else must have had designs on the inheritance." A deep frown creased Colonel Harrington's brow. Then slowly his expression changed, first to confusion, then to dawning horror. "My God," he whispered, "there is only one other person who had access to my estate, my steward, Mr. Charles Redgrave." Holmes allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. "Precisely," a gasp escaped Evelyn. "Redgrave, but he has worked for us for years. Why would he do this?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "Greed, Miss Harrington, is a powerful motivator. As your father's steward, Redgrave would have been well aware of your financial situation, and he would have known that if you were to pass away, your father, an aging military man with no male heirs, would have little use for the vast fortune. Who better to manage it than the man already controlling the estate's finances?" Colonel Harrington's fists clenched. "The scoundrel!" Evelyn's voice trembled. Then I was never safe. Even now, if he discovers I am alive." Holmes cut her off with a reassuring nod. "Fear not, Miss Harrington. The game is not yet over, and I intend to set a final trap for our elusive villain." He turned sharply to Whittington. "You are still considered a man of high standing in society, Mr. Whittington. Your engagement to Miss Harrington may have been broken, but you remain an associate of the family. I need you to send a message to Redgrave." Whittington hesitated. "What kind of message?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Inform him discreetly that you have located Evelyn, but that she is weak and in hiding, too afraid to return home. Say that you are attempting to convince her to reappear. If Redgrave is our man, he will not be able to resist ensuring that Evelyn remains missing permanently." Evelyn shuddered, and Colonel Harrington growled. "You mean to bait him into making another attempt on my daughter's life?" "Precisely." Holmes smiled. "And this time he will not escape justice." Holmes's trap, it sprung the plan, was set in motion with remarkable swiftness. Whittington, though still shaken by the revelations, composed a carefully worded letter to Charles Redgrave. informing him that Evelyn had been found but was reluctant to return. Holmes dictated every word, ensuring just the right balance of uncertainty and urgency to pique the steward's interest. Once the letter was sent via discreet courier, we waited. Holmes, ever the embodiment of patience, occupied himself with a game of chess against himself, his sharp mind working on levels far beyond my understanding. Meanwhile, Colonel Harrington paced like a caged lion, his fury barely contained. Evelyn sat beside me, pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It was just after nightfall when a reply arrived. Holmes took the note from the courier, unfolded it, and scanned the contents with a satisfied nod. "As expected," he murmured. I leaned closer. "He has agreed to meet?" "Indeed." Holmes held up the letter. "Redgrave expresses great relief at Miss Harrington's survival. He wishes to speak to Whittington privately, to discuss the best course of action for her safety." He glanced at Evelyn. "I suspect, Miss Harrington, that had we truly left you in Whittington's care, you would not have lived to see another sunrise." A shudder passed through her, but she straightened her shoulders. "Then what shall we do?" Holmes smiled faintly. "We shall give Mr. Redgrave precisely what he wants, a meeting with Mr. Whittington. But, of course, we shall be listening." At the appointed hour, Whittington sat alone at a small table in the dimly lit back room of a London tavern. Ménoé room had been chosen deliberately, a place where whispered conversations often went unnoticed, where deals were made in hushed tones. Hidden in an adjacent chamber, Holmes, Colonel Harrington, and I listened intently through a small gap in the wooden partition. Inspector Lestrade and two of his men waited outside, ready to intervene at Holmes's signal. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Then the door creaked open. "Mr. Whittington," came a smooth voice, rich with feigned warmth. "I cannot tell you what a relief it is to hear of Miss Harrington's survival." Charles Redgrave stepped. Inside, his figure cast in shadows. He was a man of medium build, impeccably dressed, his thinning hair neatly combed. He carried himself with the easy confidence of one accustomed to wielding quiet power. Whittington nodded stiffly. "She is alive, but she fears returning home." Redgrave sighed, shaking his head. "Understandable, considering the circumstances. But surely you must see, Mr. Whittington, that there are certain risks involved in leaving things unresolved." Holmes tensed beside me. The trap was closing. Whittington feigned ignorance. "What do you mean?" Redgrave stepped forward, lowering his voice. "A woman in hiding, particularly one of her station, is vulnerable, and if the wrong people were to find out where she is—" He let the words hang. "It may be best for all involved if she were to disappear permanently." Colonel Harrington's breath hitched beside me, but Holmes held up a hand silencing him. Whittington, playing his role well, kept his tone even. "That is not an option." Redgrave sighed again, as though speaking to a slow student. "I understand your attachment, but let us be pragmatic. A quiet accident, something swift and discreet, ensures no scandal, no loose ends. I would, of course, see to it that you are well compensated for your cooperation." Holmes's eyes gleamed. That was all he needed. Without warning, He threw open the partition and strode into the room. "Ah, Mr. Redgrave, such an intriguing proposition, though I fear you may find Scotland Yard far less receptive to your generosity." Redgrave spun around, his face draining of colour. "What?" Inspector Lestrade and his men burst through the door. "Charles Redgrave," Lestrade announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." Panic flickered in Redgrave's eyes. "This is absurd. You have no proof," Holmes smirked. "On the contrary, you have just provided a full confession." He gestured toward the partition. "I took the liberty of ensuring we had witnesses." Colonel Harrington stepped forward, his face dark with fury. "You would have murdered my daughter." Redgrave's composure finally shattered. I had no choice. The debts, the estate, it was all crumbling. Her inheritance could have secured everything." Holmes sighed. "Ah, the eternal folly of greed." As Lestrade's men seized Redgrave, Evelyn stepped forward, her voice trembling. "And if I had died, my father would have been next, wouldn't he?" Redgrave's silence was answer enough. Holmes turned away. "Take him away, Lestrade. I find his presence tiresome." As the inspector led the disgraced steward from the room, Evelyn let out a breath she had been holding. She turned to Holmes, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You saved my life." Holmes merely offered a small smile. "It is what I do, Miss Harrington." The final reflection. The arrest of Charles Redgrave sent ripples through London society. The newspapers relished every detail of the shocking scandal. A trusted steward, driven by greed, plotting the death of his master's daughter for financial gain. His confession, along with Holmes's meticulous reconstruction of events, left no room for doubt. By morning, Redgrave sat in a prison cell, his fate sealed by the very scheme he had orchestrated. Evelyn Harrington was safe at last. Her father, despite his gruff demeanour, embraced her with such palpable relief that even Holmes, ever the observer of human nature, allowed himself a moment's pause. The colonel wasted no time in withdrawing from London and taking Evelyn back to the countryside, away from the treachery that had nearly claimed her life. It was 2 days later that Holmes and I found ourselves back in our familiar quarters at Baker Street. The case, now a closed chapter in the annals of my notes. Rain pattered softly against the window, and the scent of pipe smoke curled through the air as Holmes sat in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I must say, Holmes," I remarked, folding away the morning paper, "this case had all the makings of one of your finest. A vanished bride, an inheritance conspiracy, a hidden villain. It will make for a most thrilling account." Holmes exhaled a stream of smoke, his eyes half-lidded in thought. "Thrilling, perhaps, though hardly one of my more complex endeavours. The moment I read of Miss Harrington's disappearance, it was evident that no mere elopement had taken place." I raised an eyebrow. "You deduced that immediately?" "Of course. A bride fleeing on the eve of her wedding. Such tales have graced many a scandal sheet. But Miss Harrington was no reckless romantic. A woman of means and independence does not vanish without careful preparation. Her escape was hasty, which suggested fear. And fear, my dear Watson, always has a source." I nodded, impressed as always. "And Redgrave? At what point did you suspect him?" Holmes tapped his fingers against the armrest. His name was but a footnote at first, a mere mention in the Colonel's affairs. But his occupation gave him means, and Miss Harrington's inheritance gave him motive. When we found no evidence of her willing departure, it became clear that someone else sought to dictate her fate. Redgrave, as steward, was in the perfect position to benefit from her misfortune. I shook my head in admiration. And yet your methods were as much theatrical as they were brilliant. The trap you set for him, it was masterful. Holmes offered the faintest of smiles. A man with secrets, Watson, is like a rat in a trap. Offer him an escape, and he will reveal himself in his desperation. I leaned back, thoughtful. And what of Miss Harrington? Do you believe she will recover from this ordeal? Amdodo was silent for a moment. Then, with a contemplative sigh, he replied, "Time will heal her wounds. But there is a lesson in all of this, Watson, one that is often overlooked in matters of fortune and inheritance." I waited, knowing that Holmes never spoke without purpose. He turned to me then, his sharp gaze softened by an air of quiet reflection. "It is a peculiar thing, is it not, that wealth, which ought to bring comfort, so often invites peril? The greater the sum, the greater the vultures that circle. Greed is an affliction, my dear Watson, one that blinds men to the simplest truth, that the most valuable treasures in life are seldom counted in coin." I smiled, shaking my head. "You grow philosophical, Holmes." He smirked, reaching for his pipe once more. "Merely observant, Watson, as always." With that, he leaned back into his chair, the fire casting flickering shadows against the walls of 221B Baker Street. The case of the vanishing bride was closed, and already I suspected Holmes's mind was turning towards the next enigma that would call upon his brilliance. For Sherlock Holmes, after all, the game was never truly over.